India's greatest internal security threat. A Prime Minister said that, Manmohan Singh. And when the country heard it, most people thought of Pakistan. He meant something closer. He meant a war inside India. A movement that, at its peak, reached nearly 200 districts. A movement with its own courts, its own taxes, its own army, and, in the deepest forests, its own government. Where Delhi's road ended, another state began. India's deadliest enemy was never across the border. For 40 years, a war burned inside India's own forests. 10 states felt it: Chhattisgarh, Odisha, Andhra Pradesh, Maharashtra, Bihar, Jharkhand, West Bengal. And inside the deepest pockets, the movement gave its rule a name: Janatana Sarkar, the people's government. A second government poured straight into the space the first one had left behind. And the strange thing is, it began with one village. They had a name: Maoist. The guns were Indian, the forests were Indian, the dead were Indian. But the idea came from Mao Zedong, that state power could be seized by armed revolution and held by the gun. The movement took Mao as its model. It organized along his lines, fought along his lines, and the name stayed. The war also had a map: the Red Corridor, a belt running through eastern, central, and southern India, wherever the Naxalite Maoist insurgency took root. It grew in mineral-rich country, Dandakaranya, across Chhattisgarh and Odisha, and the tri-junction where Bihar, Jharkhand, and West Bengal meet. And wherever it spread, it did not simply hide from the Indian state, it replaced it. Welfare schemes stalled, roads stopped, industrial projects failed before they began. The institutions that were supposed to govern those districts found themselves blocked by another authority. This was not only a rebellion, it was a rival administration. The spark came from a small village. May 25th, 1967, Naxalbari, a village in West Bengal. A land dispute broke out. On paper, it looked minor. One more fight over who owned the land and who worked it. But that is how history often hides the door. Under the slogan, "Land to the Tiller," a handful of young activists took up arms. Nobody watching that village would have guessed that the name Naxalbari would become the name of one of the gravest internal security threats India would ever face. 3 men led the first wave: Charu Mazumdar, Kanu Sanyal, and Jungle Santhal. The movement spread into the countryside beyond. Then the same fire caught in Andhra Pradesh. Between 1967 and 1970, a tribal peasant rebellion broke out in Srikakulam district. It was the first real eruption of the Naxalite movement in the region. Then the state came down hard. Charu Mazumdar was arrested. By 1972, he was dead. The movement splintered into more than 40 smaller factions. That should have been the end. A village revolt is crushed. Its leaders die. Its factions quarrel. The country moves on. But Naxalbari had left behind a harder lesson. If Indian government power was thin in one village, it might be thin somewhere else. 8 years later, in Andhra Pradesh, the movement came back. Without the romance. And with something more dangerous. Without a people's army, the people have nothing. That was Mao. 8 years after Naxalbari, a former school teacher named Kondapalli Sitharamaiah built the People's War Group. Naxalbari had taught confrontation. The People's War Group taught administration. It recruited steadily. It raised money. It built village committees. It fought wage battles. and it pushed its songs out ahead of its pamphlets through a balladeer named Gaddar into villages no leaflet could ever reach. 500,000 acres are thought to have changed hands under its pressure. The question had quietly changed, not whether one landlord could be driven off one field, but how to walk into a village, settle its disputes, gather up its loyalty, and stay. The movement won real influence among the rural poor. It fought for higher daily wages, for the rights of the men and women who worked the fields. Its cultural wing, Jananatya Mandali, carried the message in song and performance. A movement that had begun with confrontation was learning how to become permanent. Then, in 2004, the scattered pieces became one. On September 21st, two streams merged: the People's War Group from Andhra Pradesh and the Maoist Communist Centre of India from Bihar. Together, they became the Communist Party of India, Maoist. The movement now had one name, one party, one armed line. But ideology alone does not make a village feed you. It does not make a young man walk into the forest with a rifle. It does not make a mother keep silent when the police ask where the squad went. There is no smoke without fire. So the honest question is not whether the Maoists had an idea. They did. The question is why that idea found so much dry ground. Start with the land. The gap between the landlord and the landless laborer who worked his field. In many forest villages, the first outsider who arrived carrying power was not a doctor, not a teacher, not a banker, not an engineer. It was the mine, the forester, the contractor, or the policeman. For the Adivasi, Jal, Jungle, Zameen, water, forest, land was not a slogan handed down from outside. It was daily life. The forest was food, work, memory, inheritance. But the road did not reach. The school did not stay open. The clinic was far away. The bank was absent. The demand often arrived before the service. Then came the mines, public and private. The fights over who owned what beneath that rich ground grew sharper. And into the empty space, where the state was thin or simply absent, the Maoists built structures of their own. They ran irrigation. They settled disputes. They won loyalty by doing the work the state had not done. As more tribal and marginalized people came to see the Indian state as unable or unwilling to protect them, the young began to walk toward the Maoists instead. That gave the movement recruits. The recruits gave it guns. And rooted that deep among local people, it could feed itself, hide itself, and hold off whatever the state sent against it. A small spark became a wildfire. Mao had a line for it. A single spark can start a prairie fire. By 1978, agrarian revolts had spread into Karimnagar, into Adilabad, across Telangana, where unpaid wages were the burning grievance. By the early 1980s, the movement had strongholds. The villages of northern Telangana and the deep Dandakaranya forest along the Andhra Pradesh-Odisha border. The Maoists seized landlords. They made them stand before villagers and apologize. They forced them to hand back money that had been squeezed out illegally. In 1985, after a police sub-inspector was killed in Warangal, the movement turned harder against the police. For a time, whole stretches of Andhra Pradesh were reeling, and for a while, a good part of society looked at the Naxalites and saw defenders of the downtrodden, men who stood up to the grasping landlord and the rich trader. Cinema leaned in. Film after film burnished the image. On screen, they were the people's champions. The forest would tell a different story. The party followed Mao's blueprint. Protracted people's war. Take the countryside first, ring the cities, let the state fall last. The forest was the battlefield. Guerrilla war was the method. They killed the men they called class enemies. They struck at police stations and state officials, and they went after anyone who tried to stop them. Rank meant nothing. Senior officers, politicians, even chief ministers. No one was beyond the reach of a Maoist strike. Fear ran through every layer of society, from the ordinary villager to the men at the top. And when fear runs that deep, development becomes a theory. Industry withers. Roads remain plans. Investors stay away. What investor walks into a place where the state itself cannot guarantee entry? Then the center of gravity moved. In Andhra Pradesh, the greyhounds were closing in, hard, relentless. Under that pressure, the Maoists pulled back into the dense forests of neighboring Chhattisgarh, into Bastar, into Dandakaranya. This became the new base. The move had started years earlier. In June 1980, the movement sent in armed squads. 2 of them walked straight into Bastar, and the country did the rest. Remote forest, broken terrain, tribal villages, barely any state at all. In time, Bastar became the Maoist stronghold. Dandakaranya stretched across the borders of Andhra Pradesh, Odisha, Chhattisgarh, and Maharashtra. The Maoists simply called it DK. The design was deliberate. One unbroken corridor running from the Nepal border down toward the Deccan plateau. The ground itself fed the movement. Rich minerals under the soil. The grievances of the tribal people above it. Deep inside those forests, almost unreachable, the Maoists built what was, in everything but name, a parallel state. The canopy was so thick it blinded drones and helicopters overhead. Tribal villages closed around the fighters like cover. Together, they made a place the state's forces could barely enter. Here, there were almost no roads, no schools that stayed open, no schemes reaching the people they were meant to reach. Into that emptiness, the Maoists stepped. They became the police. They became the judge. They became the administration. People said it plainly. Where the state's roads ended, Maoist rule began. To hold the forest, the Maoists could not simply hide in it. Their courts heard disputes, their squads set wages. Their permission decided who could cut, build, trade, enter, leave, speak. In parts of Telangana, they abducted landlords and forced apologies before villagers. Elsewhere, contractors paid because not paying had become the more dangerous choice. Then the same machinery turned outward. The forest began to close against Delhi. Suspected informers were killed. Police were ambushed. Officials were threatened. Roads were blocked. Projects stopped. Schools were burned when a school looked like a doorway for the government to walk back in. From that point, the most dangerous thing in the forest was not only the gun, it was suspicion. Who had spoken? Who had guided? Who had stayed silent? What began as a gun to make Delhi listen had become the office, the court, the tax collector, and the border post. This was Janatana Sarkar, the people's government, the second government inside India. The Maoists declared whole regions liberated zones. Inside them, it was Maoist hands that governed and Maoist hands that policed. Of the Indian state, there was little left, sometimes nothing at all. Across the 1990s and into the 2000s, the movement dug in, nowhere deeper than Abujhmad. Abujhmad was never just a forest. For decades, it was a hidden seat of power, the quiet center of the long war between the Indian state and the Maoists. Some security analysts called it India's Tora Bora. The comparison fits. A maze of paths no outsider could follow. Ground you could not cross without a local guide. Country made for hiding and made for insurgency. At its height in southern Chhattisgarh, the Maoists ran 4 full divisions, each one roughly 4,000 square kilometers. The state held about 40% of the ground. The The Maoists held another 40. The last 20 was up for grabs. And once the Communist Party of India, Maoist, had formed, the armed units in these areas reportedly doubled. 5 became 10. More came from the villages around them. The forests were theirs. The weapons were plentiful. The young were still coming. They taxed, they judged, they ruled. A shadow government, complete in all but one thing. In their own eyes, only one thing was left to take: the power of the state itself. For years, Delhi had seemed beyond their reach. Now, the capital was beginning to feel within firing range. And now, Manmohan Singh's warning makes sense. The most serious internal security threat facing India was not waiting at the border. It was growing inside the forest. It had begun as a land dispute in one village. It became a party, then an army, then a government. And for a while, inside India, there were two states trying to rule the same ground. Whether the second government won or whether it was beaten is the story we take up next.